Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody today?
Awesome.
Good, good.
We're very fortunate in our community to have our guest speaker, Robert Harding. Besides being the state and political writer, he's taken on the COVID assignment for the past year. Whether he volunteered to do it or not, it was thrust upon him. But as you can see, he's award-winning. That's quite the impressive wall, by the way. And with that being said, I want to introduce Robert Harding as our guest speaker, talking about all the different things that he encounters and runs across every day in Cayuga County and on the state level. So please join me in welcoming Robert Harding.
Thanks, Ed. I appreciate that. Thanks for the invite too. Happy to speak to Rotary again for, I believe, the second time now. So this is great. A great way to spend my lunch since I wasn't doing anything else. So yeah, I know Ed mentioned that I'm sure that there'll be some questions, but just wanted to give you a short overview of what this year has been like. As a journalist. It's been quite a ride. I mean, for all of us, we deal with this in our daily lives. You go to the grocery store, you got to wear a mask. You got to, maybe you've changed some travel plans because of all this. But being a journalist, there's this added responsibility of not only living through this, but also you're covering it on a day-to-day basis. Whether it was early on. The early travel quarantines, if you remember those, if people went overseas, then, to certain countries, they had to quarantine, and then access to testing was limited. Now we have testing clinics, almost multiple times a week. And now it's hard to kind of remember those times when testing was in short supply. And then, to go through, the reopening process with businesses, we had a bit of a lull. And then, of course, things started to pick up again in the fall. It was funny at the time, my boss, Jeremy Boyer, had mentioned, because my main responsibility usually is covering politics. So I was covering the election, and he said, "Oh, after the election's over, you should take a vacation." It's like, sounds good to me. Well, COVID had other ideas, because that's when the COVID cases started to spike again. So had to stick around here to cover that. So I'll get a vacation at some point, I know, but it's been unlike any other year. I've been a journalist now at the Citizen for more than 11 years, and there hasn't been a year like this one. Not only personally, but professionally as well. It's just nonstop. Now we're in the midst of, we're after our local surge, and we're covering the vaccine rollout, and there's a lot of different parts to that. And then, still trying to fit in some politics and government coverage as well. So it's quite a balancing act, but happy to take any questions anybody may have.
I'll start.
Okay.
Given the news that came out yesterday that the towns and villages will be compiling lists of people who are eligible for vaccination shots, how are these towns and villages going to keep track of this and people signing up on their own and continuing the scenario of the wild west and trying to get vaccinated in Cayuga County and central New York?
Yeah, this is a good question. It's one we're actually working on. We're getting more information on, because this was an interesting twist, I thought, to the vaccination process, that you're getting towns and villages involved in creating the waiting lists. I know that the city of Auburn I believe that they're supposed to come out with the information today about their role in all of this. But yeah, I don't know too much about it right now, just because it was kind of thrown into our laps yesterday, and it was an unexpected development. But I think it's going to be challenging, just based on the resources that the towns and villages have. Plus, there's an obvious broadband issue here. The access to high-speed internet and the ability for people to go online and see these websites to begin with, the town and village websites, that is. and to sign up. I know that they did offer, you can call the offices, but I know some of the town offices aren't always open Monday through Friday just because they're, the lack of resources or what have you. So it's something that we're still looking into, but it's something that we're going to follow because we're not entirely sure how this is going to work, if it's going to work. And I think the city of Auburn will have a better time, but they have a lot more resources than many of these towns and villages do. So it's something that we're going to continue to watch to see how this all unfolds and see if anything needs to change with it.
Eileen Deloya, I have a question. Last week, the head of the county health department was on talking to us, and Kathleen was saying that they're pretty well organized to be doing vaccinations. They do it on a regular basis for kids. And I was wondering if there's any coordination between the townships and the county health department that can kind of expedite things.
I know from my interviews with Kathleen, I know that she has told me this on multiple occasions, that really their goal is to get out to those communities, and I think coordinating with the towns and villages is part of that they want to be able to have mobile clinics, if you will, where they take their staff and the supplies, obviously, and go to some of the communities farther out, from Auburn anyway. We're talking to the north, maybe Sterling, down in the southern part of the county, Sempronius, Summerhill, places like that, where it might not be easy enough, especially this time of year, for people to get to Auburn or the Auburn area anyway, some of the surrounding towns where they've had clinics in the past. So that'll take some coordination with the towns and villages for sure, to set those up. So I think that's really going to be the starting point for it, and then just making sure that they're having that equity where you're getting to different parts of the county as opposed to just doing it in Auburn and the surrounding towns here.
And follow-up is, given all the press about the failure of the governor's office to accurately enumerate the number of senior citizens in nursing homes that have died from COVID, has a citizen dug into the local nursing homes to see what their accurate numbers are?
Yeah, I wrote a story last week, I think. The days all blend together, covering this. But I'm pretty sure it was last week because, so 2 weekends ago now, you might remember the Attorney General, Letitia James, came out with her report, and it was critical of the governor's administration for undercounting nursing home deaths because, for those unaware, the State Department of Health releases they keep a daily tracker, a COVID-19 daily tracker, includes a lot of data. One of the data points that they've included over time were confirmed and suspected nursing home deaths, but those were only residents who died in the nursing home. It did not include nursing home residents who were moved to a hospital and died there. So that number was always a mystery. We had a hunch that it was into the thousands, but we didn't know for sure because the State Department of Health specifically didn't release this until Attorney General James came out with her report, and that hours later, the state health commissioner decides to release a preliminary number, which was well over 3,000 nursing home residents who died in a hospital. That data has been updated, and so at last check, there were 84 total deaths in Cayuga County. That's everybody, not just nursing home residents. But there were 63 in what you would say are nursing home and adult care facilities. 60 involved nursing home residents, specifically at the Commons, where most of those deaths occurred, and Auburn Rehab. Now, we knew for some time that nursing homes, January was a real bad month for Cayuga County. There were 59 COVID deaths. 50 or 51 of them were nursing home residents. we knew that, well, I knew that based on the numbers and based on how the Cayuga County Health Department released it, that some of the deaths that the health department reported, because they disclosed this, were nursing home residents who died in the hospital. But that wasn't reflected in the state numbers until recently. So when I give you that full number, that includes the residents that died in hospitals, which I believe with the Commons there were 9 residents who were moved to a hospital and later died, and then Auburn Rehab had 1. So 10 total in our county nursing home residents who died in a hospital who weren't initially counted with the other nursing home residents, but because of the Attorney General's report and the State Department of Health's decision to finally disclose that data, we know now that's the complete number.
Robert, in regard to distribution of the vaccine, has anyone looked into the possibility of, I just kind of makes sense to me that one of the areas, especially rural areas, the way to deal with it would be do it by school district. And maybe even use school buses to bus people. Everybody knows where their school is. You know, everybody knows where their school is. Most people can get to their school. The facilities are usually large enough, parking, so on and so forth. And even the use of school buses to transport people who don't have transportation. Has anybody looked into that at all?
Yeah, I haven't heard that raised, but it's something that, you know, personally, I think it's a good idea. I think you're right that the school districts tend to be the center of the community. And so, I mean, look at how they've done the vaccination clinics so far. You know, for a time anyway, they were able to do those at Cayuga and Dagaboses. Right. And they like that facility because, you know, schools tend to have a lot of space, and, you know, not a lot of buildings tend to have that kind of open floor plan that you can use, you know, for an extended period of time. So, you know, it's something that I'll keep in mind to ask them about, you know, in terms of that outreach to a lot of communities, and, you know, whether schools are going to be part of that, because I think it would be a good idea to kind of tap into those resources for sure.
Well, and the tracing and all of that kind of stuff, I mean, becomes almost instantaneously because you have the records of the school districts. It's not a matter of trying to find somebody or get somebody's attention. You have a day that, you know, Union Springs School District today, the next 2 days is going to be vaccinating everybody and anybody who's available to get vaccinated. And your record keeping, everything becomes, in my opinion, a lot simpler.
Yeah.
Other questions for Robert?
Robert, did you also report that there was conflict between the coroner and the state officials about whether one or more deaths were actually COVID related?
Yeah, that was about, you may have read, I took some heat for this. The State Department of Corrections had reported there was a death at Auburn Correctional. An inmate who was COVID positive and later died. Their information simplified it, you know, upon following up and hearing from the coroner, Dr. Duckett. You know, they obviously couldn't go into great detail about what happened, but essentially it sounds like it was another unrelated health issue. And but there is still this conflict there, because if you go on the state website, the state corrections website, it still lists a COVID death at Auburn, and that's not necessarily accurate. The way that they frame it is that they count anyone who was COVID positive on this spreadsheet, and so if they die, it's listed there as a death. Because they didn't recover, but it really leaves out a lot of information, obviously, as I learned in this process, that in this case, it sounds like, you know, there was some other unrelated health issue, could have been heart issue, you know, stroke or something, and they they found in the autopsy that COVID wasn't even a contributing factor to the death. But docs is saying, well, because they tested positive and later died, we're going to count it in that column. So I know that there have been attempts to try and correct that, but it doesn't seem like docs is willing to budge on that number.
Well, also that we went through the same issue with the AIDS problem. When AIDS first came about, they were calling deaths AIDS death. You died from AIDS. You can't die from AIDS. You die from an AIDS-related illness. And COVID is the same. You don't die from COVID. You die from an extraneous injury or illness to your body that is what actually kills you. And, that's the terminology that should be used. You should be talking about COVID-related deaths, just like they did about AIDS-related deaths. I mean, it's not the cause of death. The cause of death is respiratory, or the cause of death is pneumonia, or the cause of death is, and so on and so forth. It's just like it was with AIDS. And I don't understand why they continue to use the terminology that they're using.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind when I hear that, because I agree with you for the most part that COVID related is probably the best terminology to use, but I do keep in mind that and I remember this, when my father-in-law died, on his death certificate it listed sepsis, which that was a problem that he had at the end of his life, and that certainly complicated things. But he also had terminal stage 4 cancer. So, I get the fact that you have to consider other factors, but he wouldn't have been in a position to get sepsis if he didn't have stage 4 cancer. So, how do you classify that? That's above my pay grade, so to speak. But, I think COVID related is an appropriate term. And I think, for the most part, health departments have been careful about that. I know ours is. They refer to them as COVID related deaths because the complications from sometimes the people die and they're COVID positive, but they don't have the same level of symptoms as other people have, where they have full-blown pneumonia because of COVID, and that poses a lot of health problems for them. So it is when it comes to compiling this data, it is a complicating factor, because there's not a lot of equity in how how this affects people. Some people have been affected by it in different ways than others. So how do you classify it? I think COVID related is a safe way to go, but obviously in other cases, the State Department of Corrections is an example. They have a pretty broad way of classifying a COVID death.
Robert, go ahead, Ed.
Question for you, Robert. Being an award-winning journalist, you come with a big target on your back now these days. You've been accused by the right by being too conservative, and by the left by being too liberal, or vice versa. How do you keep your sanity, maintain a thick skin and a good sense of humor, and with all the comments and emails and nasty phone calls that you receive from people?
That's a good question, Ed. I don't know how most people keep their sanity in this, especially when you're, I think about journalists at the national level who must get this a lot more than I do. But, COVID presented a lot of stress in this regard, because, I deal with this every 2 years with politics. When I'm covering a congressional election, I've been called a Democratic water boy. I've been called a Republican shill. I've been called every name in the book from, different ends of the spectrum who hate a particular story. That's fine. If that's how strongly they feel about it, kudos to them for being a part of the process, I guess. But COVID elevated it, because not only were you dealing with the politics side of it, but you were also dealing with, the COVID folks who, there were a decent number of deniers out there, and still are, and they were adamant about their feelings and why are you reporting on this? It's not a big deal. Well, 500,000 people die. I think it's a pretty big deal. 84 people die in our community. It's a pretty big deal. A lot of, thousands have contracted the virus, which is a pretty good chunk of our community for sure. So, it's an important story to cover. How do I keep my sanity? I've learned as I've gone on that, you listen to the constructive critiques. I've been made better by readers who contact me and say, hey, I know a little bit about this subject, and I think I could help you out to improve your reporting. I welcome that with open arms. Anything to make me better. I appreciate that. But to the haters, I've just started to ignore them. Unless they're threatening or whatever. If there's nothing constructive there, I really don't care about what they think.
Tony, you had something you wanted to ask?
I did. I was basically what a lot of the reading I've been doing is the hospitals have been classifying deaths as COVID because of financial remuneration from the insurance companies. In your reporting, have you seen that as well?
I haven't seen that. I actually have a sister who works in a Long Island hospital. And, I asked her about this because it's been something that's gone around. I don't think there's a whole lot of truth to it, to be honest. But I asked her about this because early on in the pandemic, now she works mainly in cardiac care, but her entire hospital had COVID patients for a good stretch of March and into April, even part of May. And so I asked her about this, is this, is there any, truth to this? And she's like, if there is, then it's a, hell of a way to make money because of the stress that, your staff has to deal with and all the resources that are expended in caring for these people. I think Auburn Hospital is a great example. Like, they, even early on in the pandemic, take the last couple months when they were really feeling the strain aside, elective surgeries were canceled. That was a state order they had to follow. They obviously cared for the people who needed emergent care, but they didn't have a whole lot of COVID patients in their hospital. And at that time, they were facing a lot of financial strain and still are. I think that's fair to say, because of the pandemic, because of everything that comes with it, needing to add beds and all the expenses that come with that, plus, staffing, among other things. So you would think that if there was some truth to this, a lot of these hospitals, especially rural hospitals, would be doing everything they can to classify or classify any patient as a COVID patient, to make that supposed money that's out there. But I did not see in any of my reporting that to be the case. And just from what I know personally of people who work in the hospitals, that wasn't a practice.
Thanks. I appreciate your input on that.
Yeah.
Tony?
I just want to say thank you. You're such a blessing to our community with your front page stories, and usually not one, but multiple front page stories that involve national, local, individual comments. And could you explain to us what your normal day is like? How you gather your research and whatever.
Yeah, it's these days it's busy. Usually there's some interviews mixed in. I usually start my day just kind of looking over the website, and because one of my duties is to be an online producer. I do that a lot less these days, but I check the website just to make sure things are updated. And then from there, it gets into the reporting part. So, sometimes there are stories that I'll hold for a day or two. We prioritize certain stories. So, early on that day, okay, there's one or two stories that I'm going to be working on today. And then, we try to mix in, a COVID update of some sort. The reports these days, the numbers are, the reports are kind of thin. The numbers are pretty basic, and we can include those in any stories we write about, that are COVID related, whether it's about the vaccine or, anything else. Yesterday there was a story about the state allowing casinos and gyms to stay open longer. So we incorporated the daily numbers into that story. So it's most days have been busy days. When there are lulls, I welcome them. It's a nice little break, but typically my day starts at around 8:30, and it ends at 6:30 or 7. There's some breaks in between. You try to take a break here or there, but the reporting tends to, just because of the timing of when the local reports are released, usually that takes you through supper time. So they're longer days, but I think, someone asked me, how is this covering an election? I'm like, well, it's basically like 100 elections at once, because every day is almost like an election, kind of season, where there's a lot of different angles, a lot of different stories that could be written, and you're busy. You're busy almost every day.
Oh, thank you. You mentioned the Bill Carey Award.
Yeah.
His wife,
Yeah.
Mary Ellen, was a classmate at Mount Carmel High School. So if you don't mind, I'll share with her.
Yeah, she's great. When I won the award a couple of years ago, they actually, Mary Ellen and I think their 2 daughters were there, and they presented me the award, which was great. That was a great honor to accept it from them. So it was a great event.
Good, thank you.
And we're Facebook friends now, so that's good too.
Well, it's always nice to have award-winning people in our community, and especially people who have those kinds of awards, as opposed to some of the other awards some of us have. So,
Yeah.
So kudos to you for that.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Robert?
One more.
Oh, that's Ed. I thought it might be Chad.
No, sorry, I beat him this time to the punch, you know that? And maybe I missed this. I had to step aside for a moment. Department of Corrections that you mentioned, they tend to fly under the radar with their information, and then information surfaces, and now they've gone underground again. Any comments about that?
So this is, I think it's right that nursing homes are at the forefront, just based on the numbers that we see. And it's just a devastating thing. And I think that story is the number one story. The situation in prisons, though, can't be overlooked. Obviously, in our community, we have 2 state prisons here, and yes, there are people in those prisons who committed crimes, many of them heinous crimes, especially here in Auburn. But you're also talking about members of our community who work there. Docs is the largest employer in this county, right up there with the hospital. So, there's this tough balancing act, because when you talk about prisons and, the COVID situation, the vaccine, you hear a lot from people that, well, you're talking about inmates and they don't deserve anything like this. It's like, well, okay, but they are people, and they're exposed to our friends and family members who work in those facilities every day, who are important folks too. And fortunately, the corrections officers are in phase 1B and of the priority 1B of the vaccine, so that they can get those. But it has been and I think it's a lot to do with the nursing home situation, but it is an underreported aspect of this, because if you look at the data that Docs comes out with, the Department of Corrections, we know how many inmate cases there are and where those cases are occurring. In Auburn and Cayuga Correctional, they each have had over 100 cases, confirmed cases. And in Cayuga's case, there have been a couple different outbreaks there that started in the fall. What we don't know is how many employees tested positive there, because docs took the position early on, once they started releasing data, that they weren't going to release facility-specific data for employees. So we have an overall number, which I believe is, at last check, it's somewhere in well over 4,000 cases among employees, but they haven't specified, and this will take, some freedom of information requests, but they haven't specified where those cases occurred. Now, this is different than what other states have done. I looked into this. There are states that they release comprehensive data on their entire prison system. So let's say Auburn Correctional in this case, you would know how many employees tested positive and how many inmates tested positive. And I think that that's the right way to report it, because those employee cases are people in our community, and there could be outbreaks that stem from that within our community that involve teachers and students and other first responders and just a whole host of different people. But docs hasn't been forthcoming with that information. It is an underreported aspect of this, the way that, especially in upstate New York, that in a lot of cases, when you look at how these COVID outbreaks occurred, part of it, contributing factor, are the prisons. And you look at the data that the county has released over time, one of the towns that usually ranks right at the top is Moravia. And a large reason for that is because of the prison, because of the employee cases there and the inmate cases that have happened there.
Well, what's really interesting too is when you look at the amount of research that has been done and continues to be done on the connection of schools with community and how they affect community spread, and being one of the factors of determining whether or not they should be open. When you look at those kinds of facilities, including nursing homes, any residential facility where people are residents, not necessarily because they want to be, and there are staff who then intermingle with the community, those are all sources of community spread. And if we don't have the data that corresponds to that, it makes it very difficult from a public health perspective on how to mitigate that situation.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. It's a challenge for us too, because we get questions about this. People ask us, where are these cases happening in the community? And sometimes we have an answer, whether it's piecing together data from the local health department or the state numbers, with the prisons, for example. But we've learned after the fact of certain businesses that had outbreaks. Now, that was never disclosed to us, in any way from the health department or anybody else. But you find out from someone in the community that tips us off, and then we go to the source and report on it. But there's no doubt that we've missed a lot of those because there hasn't been any sort of information released at that time about this happening, an outbreak of sorts.
Hey, Robert, this is Mike Davis.
Last question, Mike.
Okay, last one. Hope it's a good one. Since you can't just read the news and then report on stuff that you read, you've got to go out and get stuff. How often are you filing for these Freedom of Information Act? How often do you have to go and fill out the FOIL paperwork to get the numbers that you're looking for?
Well,
with the state thing, or?
No, not daily. I would say it depends on the story. With the state, it's more challenging than dealing with local entities. They tend to, depending on what you're asking for and depending on what story you're working on, they tend to be more forthcoming because they know you. So it's helpful in that sense. But with the state, I'll give you an example. Last year, actually, I think it was back in 2019, I was working on a story about, it was the 5-year mark after Butler Correctional closed, the medium security prison up in Wayne County. And I wanted to give an update on that situation because it's still a vacant prison. And there were a couple data points that I wanted to include. One was how many inmates were in there at the time they closed. And I didn't think that that number was difficult to reveal. The other was how much were they spending in maintenance costs per year for the upkeep of the facility? Because one of the things that they talk about when they're shutting down a prison is that they need to keep it clean and functional in case someone comes in and buys it and can use it for another purpose. So I request those 2 data points. I'm told that I have to file a Freedom of Information request for them. 1 year later, I received the data. And in the response, the records access officer, each agency has a records access officer that handles these FOIA requests. They even mention, you just ask questions, like we don't normally respond to FOIA requests for, answers to questions. We're usually providing you documents. I'm like, well, I framed it the way I just needed answers to those questions. There weren't any documents that I could think of that would provide those answers specifically. I thought it would just be as simple as a communications person telling me, here's how much we spent and here's how many inmates there were. So the state's a real, and this actually ties in with the nursing home deaths. There have been a lot of FOIA requests filed about this, journalists like myself out of, covering state government, file these requests and, was pushed off. And then when the state didn't really have a choice because of the Attorney General's report, they finally disclose it. Well, many people have been looking for those numbers for a long time, but it was an example of how there's a real lack of transparency with these things. And yes, FOIL is nice, but it's difficult when you are hoping to do a story in short order and you're told that basically you have to wait a year just to get answers to your questions. So it is a useful tool, but on the government side of things, they need to be better at responding to those in a timely manner.
All right, Robert, once again, thank you so much for sharing your lunchtime with us and filling us with really good information and being able to put up with our questions and so on and so forth. So thanks a lot for that. I want to thank you very much for
Thank you.